Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Cloverfield from 2008. Cloverfield is kind of one of my biggest cinematic oversights, well, until I saw to do this review. This is a review of Cloverfield. I saw the movie, but I hadn't seen it until doing this review. I don't know why I didn't see it. It was a cinematic oversight. I just kept not seeing it. It was on Netflix for like forever back in the day. I could have seen it in theaters if I wanted to. I don't know why exactly I didn't, but I wanted to see it now because of 10 Cloverfield Lane. I felt it would be a little silly to see 10 Cloverfield Lane if I hadn't seen Cloverfield. So I'm reviewing Cloverfield. It's interesting to watch it now because when it came out, Paranormal Activity hadn't happened. The horror found footage boom hadn't exactly taken flight. It took a while past Blair Witch Project. There were certainly found footage films after that, but it took a while for other found footage films to happen after Blair Witch. And it really wasn't until Paranormal Activity hit and was a huge hit that people decided they needed to make a ton of found footage horror movies. Cloverfield isn't a horror movie. It is found footage, but it's not a horror movie. It's not shot like a horror movie or directed by a horror movie director or like a horror movie or anything like that. And it's interesting, a lot of what Paranormal Activity gets right, Cloverfield didn't really know how to do exactly. And that might be because this is a completely different genre, this being a monster kind of disaster movie, and those are all horror films, and they know exactly how to play those genres, and maybe Matt Reeves didn't as well with Cloverfield. The interesting thing is horror is a genre where the little guy gets into the big leagues and becomes a big director. This was done by J.J. Abrams, who was very much established. Well, it was produced by J.J. Abrams. It was directed by Matt Reeves. This was his second feature film. He had a very successful television directing career. His previous film starred David Schwimmer, the pallbearer. Yes, his previous film was The Pallbearer with David Schwimmer. So these weren't like Hollywood outsiders looking in. And this film almost feels a little too Hollywood version of something that people would do to make their movie on the cheap. They certainly did it to make their disaster monster movie on the cheap, but that's almost really the problem with it, is it doesn't feel as genuine because they almost don't know how to do it as someone who's struggling to make their movie semi-work within the constraints of it. This film doesn't do that as much. It's really trying to make a cheaper version of a big Hollywood movie, and it's still a big Hollywood movie while still bringing in the found footage thing. A group of friends were having a going away party for their friend Rob Hawkins, his brother, his brother's girlfriend, and their friend HUD, played by TJ Miller, have all decided to have a going away party. They've enlisted HUD with making these testimonials so people will tell them how much they're going to miss Rob, who's going to Japan, which everyone likes to say in reviews is kind of a salute because this is a monster movie and monster movies come from Japan and stuff. Maybe Abrams isn't that deep, so probably. You don't ever find out what his fucking job was. His brother, who's supposed to do the testimonials, enlists HUD to do it, as HUD is videotaping the party and testimonials. Suddenly, they hear a loud noise and a giant monster is attacking Manhattan, and they have to find their way out while Rob has to find his lady love, who he never got to say, "I love you to," Beth. So he goes after her through the streets of Manhattan and through a giant monster, hopefully not getting destroyed by the government attacking the monster and the monster destroying New York City, and get her back and get out of Manhattan before it is destroyed either by a giant monster or the US government. As HUD videotapes the whole thing along the way for historical sake and probably just something to do while their whole lives are being destroyed around them. Most of the time, if you watch the Blair Witch or Paranormal Activity, they just show you what you need to see and nothing more. And that works very well for a horror movie. Notice most people, when they talk about Blair Witch, they talk about Cat People, which is a great horror movie which just shows you as little as they can get away with while still making it incredibly tense and suspenseful. And that works really great for horror. Horror is a great genre to deconstruct. Look at John Carpenter's Halloween, for example. Now, Cloverfield, it seems like a cool idea. What if you had a monster movie and it's from, like, the perspective of the people whose lives are getting destroyed by the monster? Hey, that initially, conceptually, sounds awesome. Here's the thing. That's like every Godzilla movie. Most of it are the people. It's not mostly Godzilla. Any kaiju movie, it's mostly people and you see their lives getting destroyed. This one just went to the extreme angle of it since these people are really unaware of what's happening. Now you could say maybe that's a more interesting idea, but at first I was like, conceptually it's interesting, but then I went, wait a sec. This is like all the parts when I was a kid that I would fast forward through, but it's like the whole movie. That's kind of the problem with Cloverfield, is when I'm talking about how horror deconstructs itself and gives you the core elements, Cloverfield is like the reverse of that for a monster movie. What if you took out all the cool parts of a monster movie and did this whole conceptual thing? This is something monster movies were already kind of offering us. It's interesting that they don't know a lot. That is interesting. That conceptually kind of works about it, but it never really takes off in such a way because these characters are not very well developed at all. Like I said, I don't know what Rob's job is. I don't know why he's moving to Japan. They're kind of like archetypes. He loves this girl who we're kind of like, I mean, she's hot, but like, you guys went to Coney Island once? I don't really get the whole relationship. I mean, Coney Island's cool. Don't get me wrong. Going on a trip with someone in Coney Island is always memorable, but would I go in a burning building for someone who I went to Coney Island with? I mean, maybe. I don't know. I mean, how good was this trip? We saw video of it. Another thing, which is a totally dork thing that I should point out, is it keeps mentioning at the beginning of this film that this was a memory card they found, but then throughout the film they keep talking about how it's a tape. And if you have a memory card, the difference between a tape, if you're doing a tape, you will tape over things, and if there's cuts in it, what was previously on the tape would come up, which works within the film. But at the beginning title card, they say it's like a memory card, which if you have a memory card, you just run out of space. Just this movie wouldn't have happened. So maybe they transfer the tape to a memory card, which is probably the reason for it. Obviously, this movie had to be made with mini DV, or at least that's the idea of this camera, which is odd because this came out in 2008 as mini DV was kind of on the way out. As YouTube and more of presenting your stuff online, you're using things with memory. You're not using mini DV anymore because that became much harder to transfer. But then when you have everything with memory, cameras with their own internal drives within them, it was a lot easier. This had to have been on mini DV the way it worked. They do kind of take advantage of that and use it in a narrative devicey kind of way, which is a little lame. That's the thing with this movie, is it feels very manipulated. Every film technically through the editing process is manipulated, so it's a bit of a stretch to say any film is manipulated because the idea of editing is manipulation. But the thing with Cloverfield, it doesn't feel as genuine because when they're running, sometimes the camera moves in such a way as like, oh look, it's the monster, oh look at this and look at that. And maybe because I'm seeing this post the 2014 Godzilla and I'm kind of a little sick of everyone trying to milk the Jaws cat people thing and frankly not doing it as well as either of those films. Not that you could, because those are two amazingly great, masterfully done films, and you know, frankly Cloverfield and Godzilla aren't. All these films are shot in a purposeful way to leave out certain information and leave out other information to make it more interesting. It didn't feel as mysterious. It felt like that 2014 Godzilla. And with Cloverfield, when it does the things with the monster, it didn't feel as interesting in a lot of ways. I mean, I kind of like it. I kind of like the idea of it in a certain regard, but it's not as wholly original as kind of I think the film thinks it is. And it's almost like the horror found footage boom took more advantage of what it was doing. I mean, certainly having stuff taped over the tape and having it kind of have a narrative device within it is actually kind of different. It's kind of the idea, if you found the footage, obviously this is under the guise that like someone in the government's watching it, which is interesting. That is something I actually like in found footage in the genre, where they show who found the footage. A lot of times you're like, what sicko cut this together and why is this being theatrically released within the universe of this film? And this is clearly like they found it and they're compiling evidence or something. It took me a while to like the director of this film, Matt Reeves. It wasn't until Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. I really liked Dawn of the Planet of the Apes quite a bit, but I really hate Let Me In, and I'm not really that into Cloverfield. And even though this is written by Drew Goddard, who would go on to write The Martian and write and direct Cabin in the Woods, this doesn't show the sides of any of the people who were creatively involved in it that I like. I think is an interesting experiment in some ways, but it's an interesting experiment almost feels like they didn't truly think about. They have some really beautiful shots in it where they're running towards the light and they have to get out and the monster's stomping on tanks, and that's really cool. And same with the shot of the Statue of Liberty's head, which is obviously to be a reference to Escape from New York. Watching it at the time, it probably felt kind of fake. The thing is, you're supposed to get lost in these gimmicks, and with Paranormal Activity, the few times I've seen it, I always have, and Blair Witch I have. And Cloverfield, I could never get lost in it because it didn't feel like actual found footage. It felt like a Hollywood cinematographer. The guy who shot this, Michael Bonvillain, I guess, Bonvillain? Jesus, that's a cool name. Apparently TJ Miller actually shot a lot of this, but he would go on to shoot American Ultra and Zombieland and other big professional movies, and it feels like a professional cinematographer. It's like conceptually it doesn't take on that in terms of its cinematography. It almost conceptually fails because it overdoes it, and I almost think found footage works better with horror. There's a reason nobody made another monster movie like this. I think conceptually it doesn't really take full advantage of what it's doing, and it also feels like Abrams and Reeves, who's J.J. Abrams' childhood friend actually, took advantage of the fact that they wanted to make a monster disaster movie, but wanted to do it for cheaper in a more interesting way, and certainly this is much more interesting than most disaster movies and Hollywood disaster movies, and I guess you should give it some credit for that. But within the found footage genre, it's actually kind of weak because it doesn't deconstruct the monster movie genre, because you couldn't do that with found footage. It almost isn't as good of a fit for a monster movie. It feels like an inappropriate fit that wouldn't necessarily work for this kind of a movie. They have some interesting ideas. It feels too Hollywood. It's annoying to see a big budgeted film to have shaky cam in it, because you're like, shouldn't you know better? And it almost feels like the shaky cam in this is like too much, like they went a little too overkill on it. Like Blair Witch didn't have this much shaky cam. Like Paranormal Activity and all the other found footage stuff didn't have as much shaky cam as Cloverfield did. Cloverfield just like went way too far with it. It's like kind of pushing itself too far to be genuine, and in the end became less genuine because it overdid it, because it was almost insecure about it. Almost like that thing in Hollywood where you overdo shaky cam to hide that the CG in this film kind of sucked, especially with these little monsters that the big monster kept shooting out. That CG looked awful, and it's clearly like a cheaper Hollywood movie, and it's interesting in a certain regard to go like, wow, that was a cool experiment, but I don't honestly think it really worked out in the end, because all this time since the original Cloverfield and this whole found footage wave has happened, and now they're making another one and they totally abandoned this concept completely. And I think the reason for that is I don't think you can really fall in love with this film. There's not much interesting about this world. These characters aren't interesting. You're just in love with the concept, which is kind of paper thin, and like almost all these other monster movies, it's just done in a slightly different way. It's not as interesting as I think this movie, and as different as this movie tries to act like it is. Cloverfield is a slightly different take on a genre, but not enough of a different take on a genre. It almost feels like watching the same kind of genre you've seen before, but a little different, and not different enough to make people want to make another kind of movie like Cloverfield ever again. It was kind of like this interesting experiment everybody went into, and it's like culturally we all went, let's not do that again. After I was watching it, I thought like, yeah, I kind of think this was like a kind of one and done in terms of doing a monster movie this way. Kaiju films are done in a certain way and are awesome in a certain way because of these traditions, because of these genre norms. And it's almost like Cloverfield, they didn't really understand it as well. I think Matt Reeves, when he really understands a concept like Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, you get a really great movie. Same with Drew Goddard, which you understand a concept like Cabin in the Woods, you get a really great movie. But it's almost like they didn't really get it as much. They didn't get as deep into it as a horror director who usually understands the rules and exact parameters of that genre. And the people who made this didn't feel like they were as in love with it. It feels like they just kind of didn't really know the blueprints of it that well. They just saw a few of them. You get an interesting, different kind of monster movie, but not one that really loves the genre as much as something like Paranormal Activity or all the films that hid the monster away the whole time. This isn't like Jaws or something. I wasn't like, oh, what's the monster gonna look like? It focuses too much on these people, and these people are flimsy characters, which is kind of like the concept. It's flimsy because if you know monster movies, you're like, I see this shit all the time. It did well with that concept, but it almost didn't really understand the genre as well as all the people making those found footage horror movies did, and a lot of those were a lot crappier than Cloverfield. I think they did a good job within the parameters of kind of their own failure, but this was kind of like an early effort by a lot of people I like a lot more in their later efforts than I do with this one. This is kind of like an early success they had in an interesting experiment, but I'd much rather think of Drew Goddard, Matt Reeves, and J.J. Abrams for completely different things than this movie, which clearly didn't really live on much past its opening weekend. So if you have seen Cloverfield and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.